Lost to the World, a memoir of faith, family, and 5 years in terrorist captivity. In late August of 2011, Shahbaz Taseer was driving to his office in Lahore, Pakistan, when he was dragged from his car at gunpoint and kidnapped by members of the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, a Taliban-affiliated terrorist group. What happened next is the subject of my first interview of the morning. Delighted to be joining me live on the line from Pakistan, I believe, is Shahbaz Taseer. Shahbaz, good morning or good afternoon to you.
It's lunchtime for me, but thank you for having me, Giles.
The pleasure is all mine. It's good to see you. Tell us a little bit of this. Is a jaw-dropping story, quite unbelievable. But for those who don't know you and your background, explain, because obviously there had been a set of tragic circumstances leading up to your abduction.
Yes. 6 months before I was kidnapped, my father was murdered in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. He was the serving governor of the Punjab, which is in population terms the largest province in Pakistan. And he was murdered for defending a woman falsely accused of blasphemy. And in his support for her, he actually questioned the draconian blasphemy laws of Pakistan and asked for them to be amended. He was murdered in the capital city, and 6 months afterwards, on my way to work, as you said, early in the morning, I was abducted by a group called the IMU, which is an Uzbek militant group linked to the Taliban and later to ISIS. And they abducted me in broad daylight right outside my office, about 10 armed, masked men. And what led to, me fighting for my life for the next 4.5 years.
When you were dragged from your car, you must have thought, your immediate thought, apart from shock kicking in, is the fact that this could be over. I could be, my father was assassinated for appealing against the, as you said, the draconian rights. You must have thought this was a militant band who were just going to finish it for you then.
The absolutely worst part when I was attacked. The worst part when I was attacked was I presumed it was a carjacking. And, that's something that's common around the world. And it's probably the first thing that comes to you, if something like this happens. But as soon as they put me in the back of the car, I remember that the man who eventually turned out to be my kidnapper, he turned around while I was pleading and saying, "You've taken my money, you've taken my car, just let me go, I won't call the police." And he turned around and said, "Shahbaz, I've come for you." Oof. And a kind of fear that I've never felt in my life, this very eerie feeling sort of crept in. And I had unfortunately just come from a work trip from Dubai. And on the flight, I watched A Mighty Heart, which is about the abduction and murder of Daniel Pearl. So I think it's like the worst movie you can watch, if you're going to get kidnapped. But unfortunately, I didn't have any foresight. But yeah, and so I had this haunting sense of fear that I've never been able to explain. How does this man know my name? And while I'm trying to process this, they started injecting me with ketamine and knocked me out. And the next time that I woke up was 3 days later in a place that I found out 6 months later was a place called Mir Ali, which is in Waziristan, probably after Afghanistan, the most lawless, godless area with the most godless men in the area. And I spent almost 3 years there, a year in Afghanistan and 6 months in this godforsaken valley called Shaval Valley, where we were bombed mercilessly by NATO. And I say we because by that time I was running with these people. It was just, it's something that feeling is something that I've never been able to explain.
You mentioned that the film you were watching on the way over from Dubai, which is the Angelina Jolie film, isn't it? The Daniel the film about the kidnapping.
Sorry, Giles,
And so a lot of us, Pakistan we only seem to get news out of Pakistan when it's bad news, and it sort of. it doesn't, the politics and the tribal, I suppose, of Pakistan are so confusing to a Westerner that it only seems we always only get bad news out of there. And yet there are people like yourself and your father trying to make Pakistan progressive.
My father was probably, the day he was murdered, everybody said that probably the last progressive voice in Pakistan has been silenced. I don't get so demoralized by this. The thing about having these martyrs and having these heroes is that the reason that they give their life is to inspire another generation, is to inspire hope. And I always believe that, Pakistan is a conservative country, but it's not an extremist country. And we are a progressive people. We've always been a progressive people, whether it's in the field of poetry, whether it's in mathematics, in any form of it. This is one of the most beautiful regions in the world. And so I've never given up hope for progressive Pakistan. As a matter of fact, I live here, I work here, even after my experience, even after losing my father. I have never allowed myself to get demoralized by any of the events. And all of us have to have that mentality if we want our country to succeed. You cannot let a few bearded men with guns dictate the image of this country. And unfortunately, what happens is usually a minority that's armed and violent will represent a majority that is different and silent. And so, we live here and fight what we think is the good fight every single day, refusing to give up or accepting some of these laws, some of this very backward mindset in our society. And, and in that, I believe that you will never let the dream of a progressive Pakistan die.
So when you came to 3 days later and, had the effects of the drug had worn off, what did they say immediately what they wanted? Or you just literally and physically kept in the dark? And what was your were you in the dark in both senses?
I was literally, there's a very famous Al Pacino line where he says, "I'm in the dark here." And I literally, besides being in this complete solitary state, I was also getting used to very strange surroundings. For example, I was handcuffed. That's something I've never experienced in my life. My legs were cuffed. No access to bathroom, no air conditioner, fan, heating, nothing. And it's complete darkness and no one is answering any questions. No one is answering any of your questions. And also, if you ask a question, the trouble is that the guards come in and start berating you and beating you. There's also a language barrier because they're Uzbek and I'm Pakistani. So it was, I just remember when I woke up, I was burning with a thirst because of the ketamine that they'd been injecting in me for 3 days. And there was some water lying there and I just picked it and I drank it. And when I asked for more water, the man who was my guard, he gave me the most sinister smile and I'll never forget it. And this very disheartened feeling set in because I realized that's all the water I'm going to get for the day. And so, it was very difficult. You come from a life where you have access to things.
Yeah, and we seem to have lost, and I thought this might happen, because unfortunately...
Oh, I'm sorry, Giles.
Yeah, sorry, you cut out briefly.
I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, you just said you'd come from a life where presumably you were used to having access to water. Was it just a couple of questions I'll give because I don't want to lose you completely, but presumably for these Uzbeks,
yeah.
We always say that, bearded men with guns, and we have this picture of them, but for them, you were this picture of this, despised liberalism, of Western-leaning culture, of everything that they, through their particular view of the world, think is evil, and they see their cause as just, and obviously you're a symbol for that, and not seeing you as a human being.
That's correct. And as a matter of fact, for them, I was a representation of the jihad that they were fighting. So, they used to, I remember what they used to call me an infidel. And I'd never been called an infidel because I'm a Muslim. So, it's so strange that for example, you're Christian or you're Jewish or whatever your religion is, it's so weird if somebody else comes and says, you have nothing to do with us. As a matter of fact, our jihad is against people like you. And you're like, but I pray and I identify as a Muslim. How can you say this, and how can you take my entire life away and demand a ransom of me? None of this is actually allowed in Islam, which is why it's funny. So they brand you an infidel to allow themselves this kind of violence and abducting people for money.
Mm. The book is called, the subtitle is called A Memoir of Faith, Family and 5 Years. The faith. You said you were a Muslim. You've been called an infidel. I'm sorry for using that word again. But presumably you drew on this faith. And if you didn't think you had it before, was it a case of it absolutely in your darkest moments that you reinforced your faith and in your particular faith as opposed to their idea of faith?
The thing was, I couldn't understand, why is someone doing this to me? Why is someone torturing me like this? Why is someone keeping me in such darkness by telling me that I have nothing to do with my faith and that I am actually a representation of, why they are fighting? So I started studying my faith. I started practicing my faith. I started to try and find what is it in these words that radicalizes these people. They go to such extreme lengths. And I have to tell you, I always say it's like an education, in 5 years you get a university diploma. So I always say that through my journey and my education, I found out that these people had absolutely nothing to do with my faith. While they were trying to tell me that I was an infidel, the only thing that I learned was that they're so far removed from the words that this book teaches that it's crazy, that we are actually on two different parallels. So I started engaging in these heavy debates with these men about the ayats in the Quran, about the sayings of the Quran, why they justified suicide bombings, why they justified war, why they justified extremism. And I started arguing with them from the very same ayats in the Quran that they used to incite young men and women to carry out these atrocious acts.
But how was that received? Because obviously the people who are doing this perhaps aren't as well educated. They're perhaps taken from villages. They're, if you like, radicalized by radical imams, etc. So their understanding, because jihad shouldn't just be, you don't call jihad like that. Oh, it's Wednesday. It's a huge undertaking religiously, if at all. The region that we come from, of the world, this part of the world, is a very poor place. And I'll tell you, the first thing that attracts, the reason why these people go is for a sense of welfare. A lot of suicide bombers carry out these acts because they're given guarantees that their families will be taken care of after they go. And really, that's the core source of recruitment, is people's poverty, is people's misfortune, is using that your government structures, that your society structures that reduce you to these levels of poverty. We are here to fight that. And if you take a gun, you can take anything. You don't need a passport. You don't need a bank account. Let this be your credit card and your passport. And young men, 15, 16, who feel defranchised, they don't feel part of, these social circles, these elite circles, even middle class circles. They can't get access to the life that, they see now. You can see very openly on social media. They can't get access to it. So they are attracted to this. A 17-year-old boy is given a Kalashnikov and a 13-year-old girl and told, go out and take whatever you want from the world. This is their main source of recruitment. And unfortunately, because we're Muslims and we're from a poor part of the world, this welfare that they offer is the reason why young boys go. These Uzbeks, a lot of them, because a lot of them were my guards. I spent a lot of time with them. I was with them for 4.5 years. And what I realized was all the young boys that were there, none of them came to do jihad. None of them came to be suicide bombers. It was some kind of misfortune or unfortunate event in their life that led them to this part of the world. And then, the only people they had were these militants. And so they did what the militants said.
So it was, it was a, like I say, an educational experience for me.
Thankfully, most of us will only ever see periods of incarceration in a Hollywood movie. The person is kidnapped, and the next thing you know, special forces come through the door and they're rescued, and that's 5 minutes. 5 years.
I waited for those special forces. I waited.
But 5 years, and we are used to being surrounded by information, by color, by light, by chatter, and you were denied all this, which is when you have to look into yourself, whether you like to or not. So presumably you talk about that as being an education, but thankfully you had something to hang on to keep your sanity.
Yeah, well, besides the spiritual experience, besides finding so much hope in the Quran, my own father's legacy. My father spent almost 10 years in and out of solitary confinement, in and out of prison, being tortured because he was fighting a military dictator. So his legacy wasn't just protecting this woman, but it went back to the 70s of helping people, of trying to uplift, this society in Pakistan. And so that was a sense of inspiration for me. It also gave me a lot of strength to pass time. But, besides all of these things, in early 2013, late 2012, one of my guards who, had run away from Manchester. He was a Tajik, but he had run from Manchester and ended up in Waziristan. He walked into my prison with a radio. And you have to understand that it had been about a year and a half, and I had absolutely no information. I didn't even know what day it was most of the time. I didn't know the time. I didn't know the date. I didn't know anything. I was living in complete confusion. And he walked in with a radio, and we heard a Manchester United game. And after that, every week, I had the radio, I had access to, this is why I love doing radio shows. I apologize for the coverage. It's weak signal. But this is why I love doing it, because, people don't realize, but the radio saved my life. It gave me something to look forward to. It was my window to the outside world. Something that prisoners are denied.
Yeah.
And not just that, but, sport plays such an important role in our lives. And the fact that I could now listen to Manchester United games was just surreal. It almost seemed like, God had just like a tiny miracle, like he gave me a small miracle. And I never let that go. I cherished it, and I, never ever forgot that, in this darkness, I've managed to find a small ray of light. And
I've only got a couple of minutes left, and I could speak to you obviously all day about this. You must have been, I'll give you two questions. Well, you must have been concerned that you've been captured by this one group, but they all work in association, in connection with other groups, and obviously so-called ISIS, so-called Islamic State, Daesh, are around in the background, and we know what their method of operation are. You must have been concerned that you might have been passed on, if you like, to these, and what would happen then?
The scary part was that I was terrified. I was actually terrified of this. The thing that terrified me the most was if they passed me to the group that supported my father's murder. But luckily, these Uzbeks were very greedy by nature. They were so greedy that, they never reduced the price 1 cent. And when there was inflation in the country, they actually tried to link their demand in rupees to the US dollar. So this is how stingy and, greedy they were. But when ISIS started rising, these people were completely captivated by the kind of Hollywood videos that ISIS would make, the way that they would murder their opponents. And the Uzbeks loved this, and the Uzbeks used to do this themselves, just on a very small scale, and people didn't get access to these videos the way that now ISIS was distributing it around the world. So what scared me the most were the Taliban, of course. But the Uzbeks went with ISIS. And when they went with ISIS, they went to war with the Taliban. And that actually led to my eventual freedom. But what I did discover while I spent these 4.5 years in Waziristan and Afghanistan is that besides the difficulty besides the fallout in relationship between ISIS and the Afghan Taliban, how closely and intricately all these groups work together. The Uzbeks are the frontline fighters for the Afghan Taliban and the suicide bombers. But the, Al-Qaeda is the intelligence and the international arm. And then so many groups like this. In Pakistan, there's Lashkar-e-Jangvi. There's so many groups. There are Chechenian groups. There are Uyghur groups. There are, different Afghan groups. There are Iraqi groups, Somalian groups. I don't know if you had an opportunity to read the book, but the guy who was negotiating with my mother was a South Korean,
Incredible.
And what I found out, basically, we all travel to Europe for these diverse international experiences. But Waziristan and Afghanistan had so many different people and such a diverse population. People from all over, basically all the crazy people from all over the world collect in this region and form groups and carry out atrocities. And work very closely, very, very closely with each other.
How when you were released after 5 years, did you have any advance notice? Because if that must have been more terrifying, thinking I've only got a couple of days, or was it literally a case of they just drove you somewhere and dropped you, at the side of the road?
There was a war between the Uzbeks and the Afghans, and I was taken a prisoner by the Afghan Taliban as a prisoner of war, and identified, as in they were saying that you're an Uzbek because of the color of my skin. I look a little different from Pakistanis and Afghanis, and Uzbeks are fairer skinned, to say. So the Afghans refused to believe that I was Pakistani, and because my grandmothers are English and I've studied in a high school, my dialect, the way that I speak Urdu, is a little weak as well. My English is much better. So they refused to believe that I was the man that I was claiming to be. And I was sentenced through an Afghan, like a judicial system, the Taliban judicial system, into prison. And in that prison, I found a commander who had also been sentenced to do like 2 or 3 years. And he helped me escape. So I actually escaped from the middle of Afghanistan and ran back to Pakistan on a motorcycle, disguised as a Taliban. And so, that's actually the crazy part about my book, is my escape. I spent 4.5 years with these madmen. And then I just basically managed to disguise myself, get on a bike with 9 other militants, cross the border into Pakistan. They actually abandoned me because I didn't have a refugee card, and thought that I would be a liability at the security checkpost. So they abandoned me. I got to the security. I got to the small town, called my mother, and she didn't believe me. She thought that it's a setup. So the military planned this entire like what you see in the movies, like this rescue operation, and there was just little old me and nobody else there. And they came to rescue someone, but the guy was just standing there. So they put me in the car and they took me back home. And literally the next morning, I was back enjoying my life. I had my husky in my lap, eating an omelette, listening to Justin Bieber because his music was very cool now, and using all these social media sites. And none of it existed before, smartphones. And I've never looked back since. My life has been incredible. God in chance. I have, 2 beautiful kids, 1 on the way. And you really can't make it up. It's like, the stuff of dreams. You spend 5 years thinking your life is over and you're never going to see sunlight again. And then, here I am just living my best life.
The book is called Lost to the World, a memoir of faith, family, and 5 years in terrorist captivity. It's by Shahbaz Taseer. If people want to find, I'm going to run out of time, Shahbaz, sorry, but if people want to find you online, where can they find you and follow you?
So I handle all my social media myself. You can talk to me on Twitter. You can, I love talking about football. I interact with people all the time. I'm on Instagram. The book is, selling cupcakes, which are my favorites. So I hope people enjoy them. I hope the audience likes it. It's a funny story. I know it's a dark story, But it's funny to me because I survived it and I get to tell this story, which is sometimes I can't even believe is mine.
It's a fascinating story, and it puts some colour into what people might think is a two-dimensional situation. The book is called Lost to the World, a memoir of faith, family, and 5 years in terrorist captivity. It's by Shahbaz Taseer. Shahbaz, I'm so happy we were able to get hold of you. Have a great rest of your afternoon and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you. God bless, Giles. Thank you for having me.